the open pink seam first. So all that is we did a plain stitch on 12 SPI with 5/8 inch of a seam allowance. So you can do this with smaller, but then that way you have a little bit more space. So main thing when you're pinking, so pinking are these shears that look like the zigzag paper scissors from like elementary school, but they're specifically for fabric because most of them are a little bit harder. And so I will say when you're cutting with them, you oftentimes don't want to fully go each time because this last one, for most of them, how they're made, like it almost cuts it a little bit too harshly. And so you can like see these weird stops. So you kind of want to get to there and then just keep going forward. But because it's cutting all of these at perpendicular angles on the yarn, it helps to prevent fraying. So most fabric, like most of your basic fabrics, you can use the pinking shears and it'd be enough to stop it. If you want to be extra sure, or if you have like others, you can do what we call stitch in the ditch first. So I'll show it on one side and the other side will just be pinking. So stitching in the ditch is just doing a straight line, regular SPI, back stitch at the beginning and the end, but you're doing it very close to the ditch or the seam. So it's just like our understitching. So we're getting really close. And so some of the old school people say like this is what you have to do to all of them. But like I said, most of the time for the majority of fabrics that we use nowadays, just pinking is fine. And this can become a little tedious. So honestly, most people are like, if I'm going to go and do something with the machine again, I'm probably just going to go and use the overlocker because then it is a little bit more secure, it does all the things. So I'm just going to line this up. I have the fold over, and I will say stitching the ditch is easier after you've pressed it. A lot, especially if you have like the 1/2 inch seam allowance, because it's trying to like fight itself to like come back closed. And so if you've already pressed it open, it's a little bit easier to do this. You just make sure that you're only going through one side of the fabric, so you don't want it down, and you don't want to like do an extra stitch and have both seam allowances down. This obviously would also, if you did it for a whole garment, use extra thread because you're now adding 3 times the amount of thread for the seams than what you originally had. So when you stitch in the ditch for this, for like as a finish, it doesn't necessarily, like if you don't get it super close like you do with like under stitching and stuff or top stitching, that's totally fine because the main thing is it's adding an extra layer to prevent the fraying from going into your seam. And then once again, we just trim those threads. So this is stitching in the ditch. It is just pretty close. So it's an extra kind of like insurance policy so that the fraying, as you can already see, this is a freshly cut piece of fabric. It was just sewn about 10 minutes ago and it's already fraying. So this is to an extra insurance if from the pinking it starts to fray to go in. And that's why like some of your more delicate fabrics, if you're going to do pinking, this might be a good option. So you kind of have that extra kind of like insurance policy. Some people, when they do this for seam finishing, they might even like lower the SPI a little bit. But once again, especially if you're doing 2 things, it's fine. So now what you're gonna do is you're gonna pink. And so the thing with pinking is you don't wanna get too close because once again, if you get too close, then there's not enough like structural stability of the fabric to keep it together. And so over time, it'll just kind of like pull itself apart. That is usually the biggest downfall for anything like this. So pinking, grading, anything like where you're cutting close to the seam, if you cut too close, it will just kind of like start falling apart. So it can happen even like the design I was working on for that exhibit. I actually did that first with my sleeves. And so I was then just having to like patch all these holes to try and get it to come through because I curved it or clipped it like too close to the curve. So you just want to make sure that you're getting the whole thing. So like, I don't want it where I'm only like doing about half of the pinking shear, right? Like I want to make sure it's fully in there. So I'm going to kind of be eyeballing it to where it's about like 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's okay if it's a little bit more that you're taking off. You just don't want to do it like down here. And so this is easier to do just like with your regular shears on a flat surface. I also recommend doing them one side at a time and not closing it and like cutting them both at the same time. Because of how it pulls and stuff, it can start to get really weird, especially with the smaller seam allowances. So I will say both of these, just a heads up, both of the shears themselves have a little, like they require some pressure, so they can be a little pinchy on the hands, and they are stiffer than like your regular shears to get to cut. So you do, just like you want to try and get it to be as straight as possible. You want to try to prevent like this little thing from happening where it kind of overlapped and we don't have that. But especially like that's perfectly fine because I have my insurance policy of the stitch in the ditch, right? So then on my other side, I'm just going to show just pinking. So once again, this is perfectly fine for the majority of fabrics, especially what we use for like your more base things. Really, it's when we start getting into specialty fabrics. And honestly, in my opinion, when you start getting into some of those specialty fabrics, you shouldn't be pinking. You should do a different finish that's better acquainted to that fabric, right? So like using a serger or using another type of specialty finish, or you can use self-finishing seams like the French and the flat felled. Because a lot of times these are going to be like the very delicate, more like sheer fabrics. Well, honestly, at that point, you should just be using a French seam to begin with because you're going to see it. So that's why, like, really and truly, just pinking is going to be fine for almost all of them. The other end of the spectrum, like when they're really thick fabrics, like outdoor fabrics, upholstery fabrics, this will sometimes become an issue. And once again, really and truly, pinking is not made for them. Using a different, better acquainted finish solves that issue. And then you don't have to fight it as much because the thing is, like, it's like cutting through it is a fight. Like when you're using like the thicker fabrics. So it's a lot, like my hand already hurts just from doing these two on this one. So like on a thicker fabric, like an outdoor or an upholstery fabric, it's a lot. And there's better finishes out there that they're faster, they don't put as much strain on your hand, and they're better in the fabric. So, but this is what the pinking finish will look like, and then you would just go and press that again, especially to set the stitch from your stitch in the ditch. But yeah, that's pinking. So now, if we notice, there still can be some fraying, but it takes like a lot, and it's not happening as much, especially on these that were cut a little bit more properly. So that is the pinking. So